Welcome to the third in a series of the Rabbi Dresner Center for Collaborative Programs and Learning at Temple Beth Tikvah, in conjunction with the Ramapo College Growth Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I want to acknowledge the co-sponsors of this program, Joy Kurland of the Jewish Historical Society of North Jersey, who helped with the publicity and setting up of the event, and Lily Dropkin of the Wayne YMCA and the Federation of Northern New Jersey, who is our gracious host for this evening. I want to also welcome Steve Pressler, President of Temple Beth Tikvah, who's attending the lecture this evening, the Rabbi Dresner Center Committee, who has worked diligently in establishing the center. And the next lecture in our series is scheduled for March 21st at 7 p.m. at Temple Beth Tikvah. The guest lecturer will be Dr. Jacob Lebenz, and the subject being Czech Scrolls of the Holocaust and the Brno Torah, which we have at our temple. This Torah is displayed in our sanctuary for visitors to view and discuss the details of its history, as well as its journey from the United Kingdom to Wayne, New Jersey. So I now ask Dr. Jacob Lebenz to take over the evening's event.
Good evening, everybody. I want to thank you for everyone who made time for us and came out this evening. It's nice to see you. My name is Jacob Lebenz. I direct the Growth Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Ramapo College of New Jersey. Before I introduce our guest speaker, first I want to let everyone know how proud we are and how glad we are to be partnering with Temple Beth Tikvah and the Rabbi Israel S. Dresner Project. Our thanks to the Federation, to the YMCA, and to the Jewish Historical Center of North Jersey, Jewish Historical Institute of North Jersey. These are great partnerships. This is exactly what we're looking for at the Growth Center, and I encourage you to reach out. I've left my business cards on that table over there. I also would encourage you to sign up, please. All I ask for is your name and your email. We'll keep you up to date about our events. Many of them happen out in the community, some happen on campus, and if you're very lucky, you'll catch an event featuring our brilliant students. That's one of my projects right now, is to showcase our students' research and engagements with topics that concern the Holocaust and genocide studies, and also Jewish history. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Avi Weber has a PhD from Gießen University. He is a legal scholar. He's a guest lecturer at the Philips Marburg University in Germany. He's a visiting scholar at the City University of New York. And he's an external advisor to the Israeli government on issues having to deal with restitution, which will be the subject of tonight's talk, of course. Avi is new in this country, though he's been here many times. He's recently moved here with his family and 2 kids, so I'd like for you to give him a warm welcome, and there'll be time for questions after the talk.
Thank you very much. See that? Okay. Can you hear me?
Not well.
Okay, I'll try again. No, better? Very good. So thank you very much for having me here tonight. I'm going to try and give you some sort of overlook of what has happened in the last 70 years since the end of the second.
You're better off having cold
This. Just a second. Okay. And now is it better, or can you hear me? Or?
A little bit.
A little bit.
You have to speak.
It's got to get closer to your mouth.
Okay. And this is better?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So, let's start from the beginning. Just a second. so I'd like to begin with an overview of the legal history of the development of compensation law, and to highlight that at the exit point of our discussion today, we should look into and understand the special difference between individual compensations and war reparations. Okay. Does this work better?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, so the exit point of our discussion today is the difference between individual compensations and war reparation. What does that mean? Basically, any two states holding war against each other finish the war with some sort of a treaty, sometimes a peace treaty, with an annex of a reparation, which means the winning country gets back severance pays for the damages caused by the losing part. Individual compensation was never invented prior to World War II, and therefore the step of creating individual compensations programs on behalf of Germany was something very novel to the legal world. The reasoning for creating the individual compensation programs in Germany had straight and direct correlation to the moral responsibilities that were presented as a core principle of the new federal state, new federal German state that was established in 1949. And the decisions would be, as we're going to look into in a few minutes, of the different branches of law that one had used in order to create those compensation arrangements. We will see that in every crossroad that we look at, diplomatic aspects have to play a very important role in the decision making and the processing of these claims. And we'll see that the compensation acted as one of the shaping tools of the new republic that was established in 1949, as I said. So I'd like to quickly go with you to the backgrounds of post-war Germany. Post-war Germany started off at the exit point of what we call the Untergang, which means in English the demolish. Nazi Germany was basically run to the ground. Many German cities were turned into rubble, and the German economy was non-existent in 1945. As early as 1943, in the midst of the war, the Allied powers, forces met in London and made post-agreements to post-World War II realities, in which the superpowers already discussed among themselves the world without the Nazis. Interestingly enough, already as early as 1943, the Allied forces have realized the scope of the Holocaust and the importance of incorporating in any future agreement or any future structures in Germany tools and ways to facilitate some measure of justice towards Jewish victims in Europe. Unfortunately, historical for the things that happened straight after the war was the Cold War that emerged, and that also affected the pan-European way of dealing with Holocaust and the compensation agreements, as Germany was divided into two countries and the Iron Curtain fell and divided Europe, and thus we couldn't speak of a holistic, total solution to the problem created by the Nazis in Germany, but of two solutions or two structures, the one of West Germany and the one of East Germany. And one of the additional points that attributed to the creation of the individual compensation programs was the introduction in Germany, or the reintroduction in Germany, of constitutional and civil rights and basic rights notions in order to facilitate the new constitution that was enacted in 1949. One of the basic principles was that there were some set of basic rights that can never be touched or infringed by the government, and mainly because those were disregarded by the Nazis during the war, it was very important for the new government, side to side to this introduction of new thinking to German post-war society, also to create those mechanisms that would allow to compensate survivors. This all didn't happen in a or only in German sphere. This happened parallel to situation or happenings in the international arena. The United Nations very quickly after the Second World War came up with a set of declarations and understandings relating to the scope of the atrocities. Jacob spoke before of the term genocide. The term genocide was first coined in 1946 in a UN resolution following the work of a Jewish Polish refugee called Lemkin that came up with the idea of genocide and developed the theory of the need to protect against genocide and spoke of the need to compensate for genocides. At the same time, we saw a wave of new constitutions in Europe and, as I said, relevant UN and international law declarations such as the humanitarian human rights declaration, the declarations for rights of refugees, and the declaration of prevention of genocides. Parallel to those events, Europe, West Europe, started to consolidate towards some sort of a political unity as early as 1957, and this was what we know today as the European Union. And that process within Europe also helped to create some sort of a European constitution, again, entrenching basic human rights and putting it very high on the agenda. Coming back, as I said, to Germany, the establishment of Germany and actually having the Allied forces slowly leaving the civil administration in Germany, and that meant the shift of powers between the year 1945 and 1949. West Germany was under what we call civil administration of the three superpowers. So we had the American zone, the British zone, and the French zone, and basically the day-to-day life, business, and law were administered by the conquering or the freeing, depends on the terms you want to use, armies there at the point. The exit point for the entire discussion about the creation of compensation arrangements was a historical speech held by Chancellor Adenauer in 1951, addressing the parliament knowing that he has no majority within his own coalition. He spoke of the hideous crimes that were committed on behalf of the German people, and basically issued a very clear statement where the new federal state stands towards its moral obligations towards Jews, the victims, and those who survived. It was very interesting to see that at the point, or at the time, this was one of the hottest topic on the agenda, because the day that he gave this declaration about the need to engage in a negotiation process with the Jewish world and the State of Israel, he spoke also about the need to reunify Germany. But because of, most probably because of international pressure, the topic relating to the future negotiations between the Federal Republic of Germany, the State of Israel, and Jewish organization came up first. It made Adenauer to coin a new term that some of you might know as Wiedergutmachung, a term that is up until today highly criticized. It's criticized mainly from the Jewish side because it entails, so some Jewish organizations would claim, it entails the thought that money can buy and money can make things good again. This itself has been a topic that has been long discussed in the literature and also in the academic world. Fact is that this is the German legal term for creating compensation programs, and perhaps in the future also we could hear a lecture on that specific issue, but not tonight. So,
Excuse me, Doctor?
yeah.
Can you just go back? What was that German quote?
This one.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
that quote, I just said it in English, so this is the words that Adenauer used in Parliament, and I'll read it again in English. It says, and this could be translated wrong because of the grammatics of German language, but it says, in the name of the German people, unthinkable crimes have been committed.
Thank you.
So, nice declaration, big press, big fight in the parliament. As I said, he had no majority for that, but he basically tabled this concept and said this is a non-issue as far as I'm concerned as a chancellor, and this will be resolved. The very German thinking of creating a codex that would cover all aspects of compensation came into mind. As opposed to the American system that we have here, what we call case law, the European system believes in creating a codex, a very clear index of all things to be covered by the legislation. So the legislation basically covered personal compensation, meaning invalidities. It had to do also with property, looted art, bank accounts, financial rights, other legal rights, and anything else that I haven't mentioned yet. It's very clear to understand that the notion and the idea, at least from the German side, was to create some sort of gesture or a symbolic measure to recap or to find a way to bridge the need or the immediate need of survivors. There was at the time no long-term thinking, and nobody has ever imagined that in the year 2023 the federal government would still negotiate on a yearly basis with the Jewish Claims Conference in the State of Israel about needs of survivors. And so the Germans, in order to do a classical hedge fund move to make sure that they are not overpaying for what has been done, legislated in 1965 a law that envisioned the end of any compensation programs until the year 1969. Unfortunately, usually good intentions, or how they say, the way to hell is paved with golden stones, and so good intentions usually fall flat or fall short on technical and legal problematics. The structure of this codex was perhaps very good for math classes or for high academic studies. On the practical level, in no way was the system ready to deal in one go with over 2 million applications coming from the entire world, not all in the German language, not all according to the basic German standards, not all fitting the German bureaucratic way of thinking. And so you'd be surprised that most of these applications were rejected, and an average process of receiving a decision, an administrative decision according to this initial legislation, was somewhat of in between 8 to 9 years. It had to do a lot also with lack of legal definitions. The legal definitions, and this is a recurrent mistake throughout the years up until today, is done in a very broad manner in order to allow almost to include anything under the law, just to try and give the feeling as everything is considered and no one is rejected just basic on technicalities. This good intention, however, translated by clerks, usually gets you the opposite decision. And so the Supreme Federal Court found itself being interfering with hundreds of cases of survivors looking into again, these individual claims in a very unsystematic way. So at the end of the 60s, the German government was pretty happy to kind of have at least this cut-off date that they didn't have to deal with future further claims. That was, of course, very interesting, perhaps at the level of the internal meetings of the Federal Ministry of Finance in Berlin. But of course, survivors, the families, and countries supporting the survivors and the families didn't see it eye to eye with the German government. And so the road went ahead and the journey continued, and original solutions were to be found in order to enable more programs to be created. I'm giving on purpose one of the very strange programs that was envisaged in the 70s, just to show how technical this whole topic has been covered by the federal government. So, in principle, the federal government decided after the first legislation to allow survivors to enjoy from the same structures that were created post-war for returning Germans. The war ended with about 12 million, what would be the English word for Vertriebene? Not rejected, expelled, expelled Germans. So with a lot of good intentions and support of the Soviet Red Army, most Germans were just expelled from their settings, from the Baltics to the Czech Republic. It was national, it was a mix. Okay, in the Czech Republic it was more a national issue, in the Baltics it was a bit more of a Russian issue. But in any case, Germany found itself with about 12 million expelled Germans that had very little contacts with the German government or the German country before. And one had to take care of these people within the social security system. So one of the ideas was to create some sort of a fiction, fictionally recognizing the periods of time that they would have contributed to the German system, and thus creating for them some sort of a social pension. The idea was, again, to try and bring in the victims that were not a part of Germany, but were to receive a pension from Germany, and you can all just imagine how well that went. So, fast forwarding another 10 years, and thousands of rejected cases and much frustration, the German government in 1980 decided to rethink its policies. Took them only 30 years. And they came up with this three points that was kind of clear after about 30 years of doing the wrong things. A, we will never be able to really facilitate our goodwill towards survivors and their families, because no one is going to accept our administrative decision as being good-hearted and willing. So, first decision was we are going to create an organization that will deal directly with the survivors and the families, and not us as the federal government. And so started the big programs that are now run by the Jewish Claims Conference. The Jewish Claims Conference actually started to be a facilitator of the programs, meaning that the Jewish Claims Conference is a claims processor. They receive their money from the federal government and pay out according to pre-agreed programs directly to the survivors. The idea behind it was that if we allocate the money as total money, not individual case money, then we go back to the old notion of reparations, and that governments do very well. So they thought that by knowing the sums, the lump sums upfront, transferring those monies to a third party that would administer the programs vis-a-vis the survivors, they will be able, A, to work more expeditiously. B, reduce the unhappiness and contempt to their own systems. And C, not less important, would create mechanisms that don't entail 8 to 9 years of litigation for each individual compensation case. The reunification of Germany in the early 90s created again a opportunity. As I said before, the first block of legislations that we spoke about relates only to the partial, or let's say the ratio of the West Germany as opposed to the entire Germany, because, as I said, the countries were divided and each held their own proportional liability towards the crimes of the Nazis. With the reunification of Germany, West Germany overtook all powers, all rights, and also all obligations of East Germany, and so also the reunification agreement of Germany also created a good chance or good historical opportunity to come clean with the part of East Germany. The main people that were affected by these programs are all those survivors who were left behind the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain and the Cold War had a very serious effect on survivors of post-war. Those living under the Iron Curtain were, I think Czech Republic was actually they had some programs running under the communists, but most communist countries did not see survivors as victims of the socialist governments, but as victims of the fascist Nazi governments, and so were not treated in any special way from one side. But from the other side, because they were living in Soviet territories or Soviet-influenced territories, the Western allies did not allow any funds to be transferred to former Soviet countries, because the logic behind it was very simple. Any hard currency coming from the West towards those countries is going to be confiscated by the communists and used for communist purposes, and such no money was transferred then to the East. As a direct result, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the creation of Article 2 Fund, for the first time since the war, a holistic solution was found in 1993, allowing the federal government, via the Claims Conference, to pay those basic pensions to survivors that were eligible under the law.
Can I just interject one point?
Yes.
My family, my father ended up in the Soviet zone.
Yeah.
And up until the reunification, the officials negated any responsibility.
Correct.
Because we were, communists and socialists, and we were pursued by the fascists. So
Correct.
they took no responsibility. In fact, I went to Buchenwald before that unification, and it talked all about the terrible things the fascists did, nothing about the Jews.
So, first of all, thank you for the comment, but I think let's try and leave those comments that would also, would also derail. It's actually very interesting to hear that there are other topics and stories to be told, and I'll be more than happy to engage in that once we open it for questions. But that had to do with what I just said about the fact that in Soviet zones or under the Soviet influence areas, Holocaust was perceived, again, not as an individual act, but it was a collective measure of the fascism against communism, and people were affected because they were communists and not because they were Jews. So, if I remember, I'll actually tell a funny story from my own family about that. But let's continue quickly on the other issues before we bring up more topics. A very serious change happened in the late 90s. At that time, the Supreme Court of the United States made use of a very unorthodox legislation that you have in the United States, and that's called the U.S. Foreign Sovereignty Immunity Act. of 1976. Most countries enjoy diplomatic sovereign immunity, which means that I can attack you, but I'm not supposed to sue you. So even if I have some issues as a country with you, there are the relevant forums that I have to approach this issue, or I have to engage in a diplomatic negotiation in order to collect what I think I deserve as a country. But I cannot sue you before a court of law, because that's the difference between individuals and countries. But that has a clause in the United States, so that has some sort of a small star or a small exception. In the United States, it goes as follows. If you, as country A, are doing business in the United States of America, I don't care what you're doing in your own country, and neither I can influence it any way without using power. But if you're conducting businesses here in the United States, I uphold you to render the basic civil rights to people. And if you don't think you should be doing it, then you don't do business in America. So basically, you could understand law being enacted in 1976. You could understand which are the countries nowadays that are the target of this legislation, and what's the starting country that being indicted in the United States or being sued in the United States for violation of that legislation. It's not Germany. In any case, at the end of the 90s, there was an idea about allowing civil litigations against Swiss banks that were doing very good business in the United States of America, and then also the German companies, starting from the automobile industry to telecom companies, banks, and so on. The idea was very simple. The mere possibility of losing a civil case in the United States, then multiplied by a range of multipliers of thousands, if not millions, brought those countries to the negotiation tables with the large Jewish organizations and stakeholders, include the U.S. government, giving what we call legal peace for the side signing for those agreements. So there was a kind of a carrot and how to say it? Stick and a carrot system. So companies would make very clear that they immediately have to negotiate, but they would get legal indemnity, they would get protection in the United States if they follow this course of negotiations. And that led to quite a lot of changes within the personal compensation programs, because it created additional programs that overstepped or overwent the boundaries that the federal government already has allocated. This created, of course, another interesting discussion within Germany, and then you would hear those, not all of them being people who are bad, intention, not always being anti-Semitic, but you would hear people saying, I don't understand how many times we have to compensate the people, why do we have to have so many programs? But that was basically the case. A specific example of how things could go extremely wrong was the latest legislation that was introduced in 2002. This legislation, as I said before, made all the wrong turns. So it took this almost 50 years of experience of how to create personal compensation programs and just looked the other way. And so the federal government came up with an idea to create a special program to compensate Jewish survivors who worked in ghettos for the Social Security contribution that they have paid. Now, most of you must be looking at me right now and saying, what are you talking about? What is this story? So it goes as follows. There was one ghetto in Poland that was actually very organized, because it was one of the biggest, Ghetto Lodz. It was so organized that the Judenrat actually had its own currency within the ghetto. So the ghetto was so big and active at times that it created its own autonomy within the ghetto. And so many things that you would know or see in your normal working life today was actually happening then. So people got, they went to the social security Jewish establishment in the ghetto. Those who can actually work were assigned jobs. Those performing these jobs actually got the ghetto currency. And so there was some sort of a ghetto industry that was produced. At the back of the mind, again, a great German idea. The German Nazi government, of course, didn't want to hurt its own legislation, because that's illegal. You can burn Jews because that's the law, but you cannot employ Jews if you don't pay Social Security. That would, that's unthinkable, right? Because the law says that if you employ people, you have to pay their social contributions. So then again, they turned to the Judenrat in all these ghettos and said, look, you guys are working. What about the Social Security? I mean, somebody has to take care of these people, on the long run. Like they have a lot of prospects coming out of these ghettos. So, not being too cynical about this, the situation was as follows: that in post-war Germany, quite a lot of information was found about all these distributions that were transferred from the ghettos to the German Ministry of Social Affairs. And so the idea came, okay, let's create a program for those who worked in a ghetto, and we'll pay them an additional pension. Now, that was the political decision or the political idea. When the politicians left the room, the clerks preparing the legislation said, that's crazy, we're talking about thousands of people. What are we going to start now dealing again with this issue after so many years? So I said, let's keep it simple. We already know how to do things wrong. We'll have a nice law saying that we're giving money to survivors who worked in the ghetto, and we'll let them fight this 20 years in court to see how this develops. Unfortunately, they were right and wrong. They were right in their thinking, because the main issues were only discussed somewhat 18 years after the legislation came into power. They were wrong because the legislation had an article backdating all the rights to a specific date, which means that some, at first tranche was 10 years into the, 15 years, sorry, into the legislation, and then 2020 was the latest big decision of the Supreme Court. All these pensions were backdated to 97, and so survivors and their heirs, and all those people who didn't manage to finish their claim or the individual claim in the process, received their payments, and the original bill was speaking about 1,000 people. The numbers now go to over 80,000 people who received their pension and their social rights. This is again a tragic reaction or tragic known catastrophe already when the law was legislated, because it didn't really hold the necessary legal explanations. And so, just to show you how usually this is a generic example of all the legislations that we spoke of, the first law, the first wave until it comes to the Supreme Courts usually hits the same numbers. It takes about 7 years, and then you realize that 95 to 96% of the claims are denied. And the political process joint legal process, so you have from one end the cases coming up to the Supreme Court, and at a certain point you have district judges going crazy. Why do we suddenly have thousands of cases of survivors before us, blocking the entire system? What's this business? And you have, of course, political pressure, that you have governments such as the United States and Israel pushing. In this specific law, they actually managed to create something never seen before in the compensation process. They actually tried to create a fund, 2007, to compensate people for fighting for a compensation. So somebody came up with this incredibly genius idea of saying like, okay, we're gonna tell everyone that they misunderstood our intention, but because we don't want to be cold-hearted and people have made their claims and they've waited so many years, we're going to create a special fund compensating for their bad feeling and the bad customer service in our treating of their rights. That's how absurd things went with this legislation. Now, I'm going to move forward with what's actually happening and what's going to happen, but I want to be clear about one thing that I kind of did wrong to my colleagues and to my work. There's one issue that I skipped and I never integrated up until now in the conversation, and that is the changing of realities. So it's not changing of realities. It's not that I don't think that the German process is incredibly non-efficient. And it's not that I think that it's a huge surprise that every legislation brought its mitigation. But we have to remember that also the general perception of the Holocaust and our understanding of what survivors are and what their needs are and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, it's a changing dynamic thing. Whereas in the 50s, the first legislation was just to give a symbolic payment for everyone wearing or everyone carrying the yellow star. It developed a few years down the road to an understanding that some people are invalids for life and thus should receive their pensions for life as invalids, like war veterans or things like that. That's the idea of creating a compensation, individual compensation arrangements. And also our perception of the territorial scope of the Holocaust have changed. In the early 50s, Germany was thinking of actually compensating only for crimes conducted within the territories of the Third Reich, even the enlarged one, and then possibly thinking of taking responsibility for occupied territories that were not incorporated in the Reich. But what about all the satellite countries? What about Central Eastern European countries that were influenced by the Nazis? What about what happened outside of Europe? We spoke about this today, so let's say in North Africa, in Libya, that was influenced by the Italians, and then in other territories in Tunisia and elsewhere. So my point being is that it's okay to criticize the process because as a process it's a total failure, but the fact that it took so many years, and I have the number 70 up there, so just trying to figure out one reason for this very slow process is that also our perception of the rights of survivors and the needs of survivors have changed. So let's go back to the Adenauer, just before we continue. Let's go back to what Adenauer said, the ongoing obligation. What does that mean today? The ongoing obligation means that the federal German government has a yearly budget or a sub-budget to the state budget dealing with Holocaust survivors. The ongoing obligation means that if years pass and the federal government understands that you have less and less survivors, but those with us have bigger and bigger needs, then some sort of the mix of support should change. It doesn't automatically mean that the monthly direct support of the survivor would change, but it would mean that the government would think together with others, such as Claims Conference and other organizations, of how to increase the support of survivors, for example, home care, for example, other programs. For example, we just had the conflict that was ongoing in Ukraine. There was actually a rescue program that was funded by the federal government with their Secret Service and other abilities in those territories to retrieve survivors who wanted to leave their homes. And so another thing is a mechanism of paying out pensions to survivors living today in Russia, which is fully sanctioned by the international community, and still the federal government finds very originative ways to send money and send help to those who are still in Russia today, and to make sure that they get what they need. We have a structured yearly negotiation that is going to start or just started in Berlin between survivor organizations, and that's mainly the Claims Conference and the federal government. And the federal government is also working now to create a dialogue for long-term commitment and investment in future activities relating to the Holocaust and its memory. I was myself a guest at the 70 years commemoration event in Berlin, September 15th this year, where all state leaders in Germany spoke about their ongoing obligation towards this issue, also futures and years ahead when we're going to have the survivors with us. So just try to recap where we are and just to give us some sort of a background of where this all took us, or what have we gained out of this personal compensation process. So we've established a relatively strong, I would say, bilateral relations between Israel and Germany. This relation, just to give two quick examples, was created as following. Purely technical, the Israeli mission to Germany was established in Bonn in the early 50s to act as a trade mission, using the famous reparation agreement between the Federal Republic of Germany and Israel. Israel had a credit with the federal government for 10 years to buy goods and to buy things that were important in order to start helping Israel to be sustainable. The day that the reparation agreement between Israel and the Federal Republic of Germany came to an end, the Israeli embassy opened shop at the same station as this trade mission. Over the years, the contacts between the governments have grew very stronger, and today, I think, okay, aside from the United States, of course, Germany belongs to one of the closest allies of Israel and is an active supporter of our security needs. As of the 60s, in order to complete the idea of coming clean or coming well or better with the survivors, extensive exchange programs started to take place, bringing young Israelis and Germans to see each other, to meet each other, and to interact. Nowadays, we see German brands in Israel as opposed to the 50s where people were burning German products. Today, if you want to market something in Israel and you want to give it a hype name, you might even choose a German name, and the same you would see with Israeli food stands all over Berlin. On a personal note, I think that the individual compensation programs have substantially assisted in the rehabilitation of numerous survivors in Israel and worldwide, including supporting programs starting from physical but also mental health programs, tutoring, assisting, community programs that allowed survivors to return into the normal circle of society. We have ongoing number of supplement support programs coming up as needs are found. I'll give one example for that. In 2015, if I'm not mistaken, the German government created an additional support program for Holocaust survivor children, survivors that were children during the war. It's a big difference. And actually figured out that there was something called a late damage caused by the persecution in a very early age, and came up with some sort of a program compensating survivors that were very young during the war for losing their childhood. I'm sure we're going to meet that question soon when we open this to Q&A phase. It's not only about the money itself. So I know many of you heard that, and it's also very hard to come up with a number. But it's important to see the scope of activities that have come and how far have we developed with the various heads of damage that they recognize over the years. We're having also now working committees working on future challenges, very important. We live today in a world that we're still engaged and we still see survivors, luckily for all of us. I see it with my own kids, how difficult it is for them to meet survivors. When I grew up, of course, you know, we saw many of them among us, and as the years go by, people get older, and sadly, we see less and less survivors among us, and that's a huge challenge. It will be very difficult to continue to talk and tell the story of the Holocaust once we lose their stories. And so we're now engaged in a very important ongoing thinking process between all the partners and all the relevant sides to this, to think of what can be done in these coming years to make sure that what has happened remains in the collective memory and not being disputed and not being used and turned against my generation of Jews worldwide. So if I am not mistaken, these are my details, and I would be more than happy not only to tell you what I know, but to hear from you and to interact and to come back to questions that you might have on this issue and have a discussion. So thank you very much for listening, and about 2 years ago, there was this joint motion brought to the floor by the Israeli government and the German government together about fighting anti-Semitism and ensuring the memory of the Holocaust. Now, when Israel speaks about it, it's a nice thing to say, and everybody expects Israel to speak about it. But when Germany speaks about it in a form of a UN declaration before the UN, clearly it entails also financial commitment and ongoing process of strategically leading this issue. So I think if there are no further questions ado, I'd like to thank you very much for hosting me here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't need a mic, do I? No. Good. Anyway, this is a wonderful opportunity, and it's going to lead in to the March 21st discussion at Temple Beth Tikvah on the Holocaust, Czechoslovakia, and the Torah that we have here from the Brno city and the temple. So we look forward, hopefully, to see many of you at the temple on the 21st and to continue this program ongoing.